All right, so we've been talking about policy implementation, and we're going to continue today by looking at these implementation inducements. Then I want to go on and pursue a couple of other issues today, and in particular, the problem of feedback. This notion of street-level bureaucrats and implementation and why it's important. But I want to pick up where we left off on Tuesday by focusing on some general implementation strategies. We looked initially at the issue of centrally imposed rules as a strategy and talked about some of the challenges they face. And I want to go down and look at market incentives, partnerships, and education and information in a little detail. And I want to focus on market incentives initially to kick this off this morning. And let me say this about market incentives. There's been an increasing emphasis in the United States and also in many other developed countries in recent years on using so-called market incentives to implement public policies. There are so many examples of this. It's become so ubiquitous and widespread that it's almost become a kind of a political theology. That, well, you know, the best way to get things done is to use economic incentives. Pay people for doing the right thing. Give them reductions on their taxes, tax credits. Whatever kind of inducements you come up with. One of the best examples recently is in debates over environmental policy and in particular over climate change. A major initiative of the Obama administration, for example, is the notion of cap and trade, which essentially means that emitters of greenhouse gases, in particular utilities and large industrial sectors, would get a credit if they contain their carbon dioxide emissions within a prescribed cap. And to make that cap economically worthwhile, if they exceed their compliance, which is to say if they reduce their emissions even further than the cap will regulate or prescribe, then they can do what with those emissions that they save? They can basically sell them to somebody else that's having a difficult time achieving those reductions because they can't afford carbon capture technologies or fuel substitution or other means to obtain emission reductions. So it's an economically efficient means of achieving the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So far, of course, the Congress of the United States has not approved a cap and trade policy under the Clean Air Act for carbon dioxide. So the policy remains just a theoretical policy. Is there precedent for cap and trade in environmental policy? Anybody know? Europe? Europe's been doing this for a couple decades now, parts of Europe. And even here in the United States, the Clean Air Act of 1992 has a cap and trade allowance for sulfur dioxide, an air pollutant. And in fact, it's been working. Utilities throughout the United States actually trade emission rights. And the evidence is very, very strong that it has reduced sulfur dioxide emissions, because what it's done is large utilities that can afford to use clean coal technologies have brought down their level of sulfur dioxide emissions. They've sold their tradable emissions allowances to poorer utilities, and they're allowed to pollute more. So, cap and trade being one example of market incentives. Some advantages and disadvantages. Clearly, market incentives are flexible. Basically, they give you a lot of room for discretion. You can participate or you can't participate. It's up to you. It's an inducement to participate. You can actually earn greater revenues. So on programs like the environmental protection programs, it's a good strategy. However, strategies are sometimes unclear. When we talk about market incentives, we assume that there's a clarity, that everyone understands what it means to be efficient, or everyone understands precisely what price point, for example, a charge or a fee or an allowance should be set. And that's not true. By experience, what has to happen, what does happen, is that it takes a long time before the market sorts itself out, and we can learn, in fact, how much savings can actually be engendered, and whether or not it will be worth your while. And in fact, what often happens is that a lot of organizations that participate in these strategies participate through what's called low-hanging fruit, which is an expression that economists use that means you participate if it doesn't cost you very much and if it's easy to enter. And let's say you're a large utility company and you were going to convert all of your old coal plants to natural gas anyway, because the old coal plants are so old and can't meet emission standards. You were going to shut them down and convert to natural gas, which is now fairly economical and plentiful, right? So you were going to do that anyway as part of your business strategy. So, okay, we'll participate. We'll participate in this program. Also, how does one assess compliance? Is progress measured through, sorry, I should have corrected that, but is progress measured by participation, or is progress measured by actual achievement of some larger goal? And oftentimes you'll hear in market incentives programs, people say, well, this is a good program because lots of members of the affected universe participate. So is progress measured by the number of participants, or is progress measured by some objective goal like the bringing down of emissions? So that's something to participate. And how do you assess compliance? Level of change, how much gain is genuine, and how much is a pecuniary effect? And let me stress what I mean by pecuniary effect here. You recall some weeks ago we were talking about assessing public policies from an economic perspective, a benefit-cost perspective. Economists often argue in policy analysis conversations that what we often define as a real benefit isn't, like redevelopment agencies being an example, isn't an actual gain to society. It's just taking a gain that would have been made in one location, moving it to another. Did you see how that might play out in something like an emissions trading policy? Should be pretty obvious. Basically, some would say you're paying for the right to pollute. You know, Southern California Edison can afford to convert its old power plants to clean coal and natural gas. And they even have some allowance for renewable energy, because in California there's lots of economic incentives to adopt that. So they'll trade emissions with some utility in Arizona or Utah. And that utility is basically buying the right to pollute more. So all we're doing is moving the pollution from California to Utah. That's a pecuniary effect. It's not a real gain. So, something to think about. Questions about that? So, market incentives. Market incentives are widely used in environmental policy. It's probably the one area where we see market incentives more widely used than in any other policy area. It's starting to be used in, as we'll see in a little bit, education to some extent. Field of public education with mixed results. We'll talk about No Child Left Behind. Mary?
Can you say how you think that relates to, like in Orange County, we siphon like the gas from the landfill and
Yep.
we sell it to a third party back to the busing company as fuel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a county entity selling it, the landfill back to itself, but it's through.
Yeah, you have different agencies that are in charge of the generation of power versus those that are managing the solid waste.
Right, but I mean, it still ultimately comes back to the county budget, but it's just done through this.
Right. But it's a good way, it's because the county can't necessarily enforce environmental policies on other, like transportation agencies which operate independently. So this is a good way to induce.
To itself, in a way.
Yeah, but you're inducing other actors that you don't have a direct command or control over to do certain things that benefit the county as a whole. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of local governments do this in the United States. It's sort of like school systems. School systems are parts of counties and cities, but they're often governed by their own special districts. And the government doesn't have, the county government may have control over buildings, school buildings, but they don't necessarily have control over other aspects of their budget. So you try to induce, through various ways, the school system to do certain things. Or in Orange County Transportation. Orange County Transportation Authority is an independent agency that has its own, does get money from the county, but it also has its own revenue source, right? And its own director. And as a result, does it always do what the county wants it to do? No. In fact, that's a real source of controversy. The county would like more bus lines, would like more transit-oriented development in some areas of the county. OCTA says, well, we operate on a narrow budget margin. You don't give us added funds. We have to take it out of ridership, so we have to set our priorities differently. It's a good question, and it really ties in. Okay. So a couple things about voluntary partnerships. I mentioned last time, this is an innovation that's also been done in a lot of different areas of public policy, but it basically says that the government cannot be solely responsible for implementing programs, cannot be solely responsible for implementing policies. So they need to work with non-state actors. They need to work with the civil society. And again, environmental examples seem to predominate in this area because these are where most of the innovations in implementation have taken place. But there are many ways in which this works, particularly in the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency, for example, has decided to negotiate with all 50 states what are called performance agreements, in which basically they delegate to each state ways of complying with the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, all of these variety of alphabet soup of federal environmental laws out there. And basically the states are given the discretion for carrying out, implementing the laws. What do they get for it? Well, what they get for it is a promise that if they comply in their own way, they will get funding for non-environmental programs. If you agree to meet environmental requirements and do it in your own individual way, we'll make sure that you're getting highway funds for improving your highway system. We'll make sure you get public works funds for improving your infrastructure. The idea is to transfer it into some non-environmental area to induce compliance. And one way that the federal government can induce compliance is to transfer block grants of money for various programs. This is a fairly old concept, fairly old meaning it goes back to the early 1970s. One of the interesting things about these performance partnership agreements is they began, and I feel compelled to say this given the state of our federal budget, this began in an era when the national government was running surpluses. And states were never running surpluses to speak of very much. But the federal government was running surpluses. And so the theory was you have all this extra money, you can either reduce taxes or you can take these surpluses and use them in some constructive, distributive fashion to achieve a social good. And so the idea was to transfer money to states to induce them to do certain things. Federal facility compliance agreements, another form of partnership. Throughout the United States, you have lands that are owned by federal agencies, military bases, weapons sites, national laboratories, all kinds of things that are run by the federal government, many of which have been shut down, and many of which, like the Great Park, which before it was a great park, or before it was in becoming a great park, was what? It was a Marine Air Base, El Toro. And of course it's pristine and clean and pure, and your kids can play in the dirt, right? Seriously, it's a pretty contaminated place in spots. That's a lot of work that needs to be taking place. And there's actually a federal facility compliance agreement between the state of California and the Department of Defense on cleaning up El Toro. And in fact, much of the federal monies that are going to the Great Park are not going to the park. That's coming out of development funds that are being raised by the city of Irvine, as you know, working in partnership with the private sector. The federal government has an agreement with the state of California to clean up El Toro and to make it suitable for the things that Irvine and the state of California would like to do in Orange County. So these are highly flexible. They're negotiable for both sets of actors, that the state and the federal government, state governments and local governments, all of these. The agreement, this is very important, the agreement has the force of law. Even though it's not something that was made by Congress, even though it's not a piece of legislation, it's not a statute, it's something that's simply negotiated by parties. Once it's negotiated, it has the force of law. And that's significant because it's one of the few examples that we see in the United States of a situation where a state can actually force the federal government to obey a law. And usually the other way around. The federal government says we, under the Constitution, under the Commerce Clause, we can trump the state. Well, once you agree to this, you agree. It's like a compact. So, but they do have criticisms, and I wasn't thinking of the Great Park when I said this, but I guess it fits. Critics charge that such agreements tend to be negotiated in secret, often away from public visibility. Candor is an advantage in the agreement. You know, if you can be candid and secretive and do all kinds of negotiated things out of public view, you can often come to a real agreement. We know this to be true in international relations. It's also true in domestic policy. But it can be a problem in terms of later enforcement, because people will often criticize things. Oh, I didn't know we would be committed to doing that. Oh, wow. So in exchange for the federal government promising to clean up El Toro, Orange County and the state of California commits to transforming this into a park and invest. Wow. Okay. Gee, wished I would have known that. They should have covered that back in the Orange County Register. Well, they couldn't because the agreement was negotiated in secret. And the other aspect of this has to do with policy analysis. And I think this overlaps with much of Radin's discussion in Beyond Machiavelli. Policy analysts, when they look at these agreements, oftentimes they evaluate the process of agreement. They'll say, this was an effective process because the parties came together and agreed on A, B, C, and D. And they concentrate on the negotiations. They concentrate on the substance of agreement. What they don't pay as much attention to is the results the agreement bring about. Now, I would argue that that's partly a function of time. You don't know how to evaluate them until you see their results, which may take years to occur. But nevertheless, this is a problem in the literature. And when you look at policy analytic studies of these partnership agreements, what you'll notice is that the agreements oftentimes emphasize the process by which stakeholders came together and agreed on something. And might even say it was successful because they agreed to do the following things, and a far greater number of things that would have been achieved if they didn't come together. But that's not the same as analyzing the outcomes. Questions? Let me stop there. Questions? Does this make sense? And then finally, education and information. I want to say a little bit about that. Lots of consumer programs, not just environmental programs, but health, nutrition, all kinds of labeling and alerting processes that are used to induce you and I directly as citizens to do certain things in our lives that will achieve certain policy objectives. Some people would say that if centrally imposed rules are the most intrusive way of inducing people to do things, because you have a set of rules that are compelling institutions to change the way they do business, and so on down the line. Education and information is the least intrusive. Turn off the TV. Don't read the magazine. Don't look at the sign. Don't read the billboard. It's up to you. It's a totally voluntary process. And it's supposed to impinge on individuals. There's no real way to control it, which is also one of its problems or challenges. It's highly flexible. As we know, information can be tailored to a variety of audiences and a variety of contexts, and governments spend a lot of time trying to use information to induce people to change their behavior. Many examples of this that we know, particularly in terms of consumer product safety. So that's a good thing. But clarity and transparency is a problem. You have to be very careful in crafting a message for the affected audience. And you have to ensure that you prescribe a solution. It's not enough, and there's been a lot of research on this, it's not enough to simply warn people about something. Don't do this. You have to tell them why they shouldn't do it. What would happen if they did do it? And one of the most direct examples of this, and there's been a lot of political debate in the public health community about this, is warnings on cigarettes or tobacco products. Years ago, those warnings used to say, warning, cigarettes may be hazardous to your health. Maybe hazardous to your health. Maybe not. It's kind of indifferent, indecisive. Now what do they say? Anybody know? Smokers in here? What do they say on the packs of cigarettes?
Known carcinogens.
What's that?
They have known carcinogens.
They have known carcinogens. That would dissuade me. Yeah, it's pretty direct. It's not only telling you not to do something, but it's telling you the consequences if you do it. So can choose to ignore warnings or not. Because education and information can be ignored or misunderstood, it's difficult to assess effectiveness. We do know, a number of studies that have been done on this suggest that when the information is relevant to people's interests, the information tends to be effective. Now, what makes something relevant? Well, that depends on the audience. But for example, we know this in California with things like water and electricity, utilities. If you can convince people that if they do certain things, they will save money. They will pay less on their bill if they shut off their lights. You know the debate with the new fluorescent bulbs? How many of you found you cannot read with those new lights? Strange way of asking questions. Okay. We have to buy these new fluorescent bulbs because incandescent bulbs have been banned. And one of the things that Federal Trade Commission and others have tried to do is to figure out a way of inducing people to use them, to buy them. A lot of consumers are still resisting. And one of the most effective tools is the fact that they use about 75% less electricity for the same illumination. And they last longer. which means that in the long run, you save money both on your electricity bill and on the bulb itself.
Isn't there a major issue with the disposal of them? I mean, I think they have certain chemicals that shouldn't be in landfills.
Mercury.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
mercury. You're supposed to be taking them to a special location, like
Yeah.
with your batteries, but
It's a great question.
landfills anyway.
It's a great question, and the message is extremely mixed. There is less mercury in the average fluorescent bulb that's used in regular electrical appliances than there is in the kind of household thermometers that you use when you have a fever. And when you break those, it's kind of a dangerous thing. There's less mercury in them. But the question is, how much is a lot with mercury? Because it's a very pernicious substance that if it gets in the environment, if it's inhaled, particularly children and elderly, it's very, very dangerous. It's very toxic. Worse, and some of you have seen this on the packages that come with the bulbs, they give you this elaborate set of instructions, what to do if it breaks. Open the windows, put a mask on, sweep the contents into a sealable plastic container, and then dispose of it separately from everything else. Now, it doesn't sound very concerted. I mean, it sort of sounds like, wow, I just went out and bought toxic waste for my house. Wow, what a cool thing. But it's a great question because I think it really gets to the heart of this matter. What's relevant? Is the saving money relevant, or is the health and safety of my household more relevant? That's one of the debates that's going on within the consumer community on this. And it's starting to resonate in Congress. Congress is reconsidering whether or not there should be this national mandate on replacing incandescent bulbs because of this concern. So if the issue of relevancy is cost savings, then people will do it. The other thing I will say in conclusion about all this is that you'll notice that these inducements, like other policy elements we've talked about over the past few weeks, are not conducted in isolation. Normally what you have is a set of implementation strategies that use some combination of these devices. So there's regulation, but there's also some market incentive at some level, plus there's education, plus there may be a partnership.
Well, an interesting example of the education and information strategy is Mexico uses soap operas to promote family planning.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons they do it is the government doesn't want to come out as being like enacting policy that is pro-family planning.
Yes.
Because the church hasn't
That's
endorsed it,
right.
and so they just put the message in soap operas.
Yeah, that's a great example
It's been
because
really effective.
it is effective and it shows the combination, which is culturally shaped, of using a kind of a partnership and a form of education. Form of partnership that makes sense because, as you point out, if the government promoted directly family planning in Mexico, there'd be tremendous political opposition from those political parties like the PAN, which is very, very strongly aligned with the Catholic Church, and there'd be tremendous political opposition, political risk. But if you can do it through a very popular medium that many people in Mexico enjoy, namely soap operas, then you can get the message through without it seeming to come from government. And of course, Mexico does have, unlike the United States, the government and the media work in a very close partnership. Some people would say that's bad because it's sort of, in terms of what we consider freedom of expression or freedom of speech, is not something that's as embedded a part of the tradition as it is in a libertarian society like the United States. But it works. It works. For sure. Other questions? Feasibility. Now, we can spend all the time we want to talking about the challenges of various strategies to induce implementation. But when you talk about inducements, whether it be rules and regulations, whether it be marketing incentives or economic incentives or educational programs or partnerships, you still have to talk about resources. There has to be money and people and talent available to implement public policies. And I want to spend some time on this because resources not only are becoming, but I would say in virtually every country in the world have become perhaps the paramount issue in shaping implementation strategies and helping governments decide how and why they're going to try to implement policies in certain ways. And let me suggest that we can actually unpack this problem as having sort of three distinct but interrelated aspects. The first is the collecting of revenues. Now you might say, well, what's the issue there? You know, governments always tax. It's easy. And then it's just a question, as we saw last week when we talked about redistributive policies, and before that, with distributive policies, where you set your priorities, how you want to allocate those revenues. Well, not so fast. It's a difficult challenge. It's a difficult challenge for developing nations because they simply don't have the capacity to raise large amounts of revenues, which, by the way, great example that you pointed out with Mexico really fits this perfectly, I think. You know, the state does not have a huge capacity to regulate family planning, even if they had it in their mind to do so. They don't have the capacity to do so in terms of a public health sector that penetrates to the lowest level of society. You're using other vehicles that do have those resources, like the media, right? Which is it's a good strategy. It fits the cultural constraint. But let me suggest this is also a constraint in more developed societies where a policy strategy, and this is an increasing trend, not just at the national level, but within states, of what we call self-funding. We see this in California. Oftentimes when a new public policy is introduced, particularly in recent years, the expansion of the community college system, the expansion of our water resources system. The legislature will say, well, that's fine, but we're not going to impose the responsibility for those policies on all Californians who pay taxes. Not every Californian attends community college. Not every Californian benefits from expanding the state water project. I know, probably turning around and saying, well, but we all consume water, and we all eat food, which is grown by the water that's provided. But the way legislators think about these things tends to be geared very much to this distributive model of policy that we've been talking about. So what they'll do is they'll require self-funding, and we're going to look at an example of this in a few minutes and how this game can be played in a variety of directions. Self-funding, which is done in many developed polities, simply says that a public policy has to, in effect, have its own trust fund that is prescribed and allocated for that policy. Now, sometimes the reasons for doing this are really very good economics. Social Security, remember we talked about pension systems a couple weeks ago. Social Security is a very good example of this. When the Social Security system was established in 1935, the United States and later European governments that adopted comparable systems adopted a strategy in which they said, the only way this can really work is if the money that pays for people's retirements is put into a separate, off-budget category. It can't be intermingled with expenditures for environmental protection or building roads or post offices or whatever, national defense. It has to be kept in a separate fund. Why? to build public trust. If you're asking people to set aside a portion of their income that they may never see, they may not live to see it. Of course, their children might benefit from it, their spouses might benefit from it, but they may never see the benefits. To build trust and confidence, you've got to ensure that those revenues are put in a kind of a lockbox that is devoted specifically to that program. That's how Social Security was designed. It built public confidence. It became an enormously popular third rail of politics, as we say in the United States, precisely for that reason. Now, lockboxes can still run out of money. That's another issue, another day. But the point is that it makes the program separately and independent from other variability in tax revenues or in policy decisions or policy priorities made by other government agencies. In the United States, Social Security isn't the only policy we do this for. In the 1950s, beginning in the 1950s, we did this with a number of public works programs. And probably the best example is called the Highway Trust Fund, which was established back in 1956. At the same time, the federal government created a national system of interstate and defense highways. Now, why did they create a separate trust fund? First of all, let me ask, how is this trust fund funded?
Petrol taxes?
Mm-hmm. Taxes on gasoline, which constitute a significant portion of what you pay at the pump. You can read the fine print on the pump, it'll say, you know, how many pennies are going to California. Yeah, that's right. Petrol taxes. Why did they establish it this way? Why not just take tax revenues and just say, well, we're going to build more highways? Right.
Oh, so I think this with people who are using the highways paying for them.
Yeah, the idea is highways really should be paid for by those who are the beneficiaries of it, which means those who drive motor vehicles, both trucks as well as automobiles.
And came with a massive increase of the taxes, as far as I know.
It did.
So that was kind of a way to defend that increase.
Precisely. If we're going to charge you for using the highways, essentially it's a user fee, if you stop and think about it. You don't pay a toll. You know, Californians hate to pay tolls on highways, as we know. But we do pay a toll. Every time you go to the gas station and fill up your car, you're paying a user fee to use the road system, the highway system. The idea was really twofold. One, there would be a dedicated fund that would be paid for equitably by those who benefit from the public works, which means that it would not be a burden to the rest of society. The government knew, the private sector knew, that roads, particularly superhighways, would not only need to be built, but would need constant maintenance over time. In a sense, it's a similar principle to Social Security. What you're saying is this is not a one-time deal. You've got to build the thing, and then you've got to maintain the thing. And if you're going to maintain it into the distant future, indefinitely, you've got to be able to have some assurance that to build public confidence that this thing will actually work. So that was the first reason. Second reason, very interestingly, is that it created a guaranteed source of revenue to support the ever expansion of the system according to needs. The theory is, as the population grows, as society becomes more urbanized, there will be more people who will drive. They will drive further. In the 1950s, these were all thought of as good things. Oh, and you'll have a bigger car, which is even better. And it'll get 6.5 miles per gallon. But anyway, all right, so you'll have bigger cars, you'll drive faster, further. That's good for the economy, and we'll have a guaranteed way of improving the system as the revenue stream expands. Hiring, training, and equipping of personnel is another issue that's very important. To regulate and to bestow benefits. Many programs, as Radin, I think, elegantly points out, are complex precisely because, unlike the past, where the job of the government was simply to pass money through or to simply enforce some regulation, increasingly government programs are very complex in that they require people who are expert in monitoring results, people who are highly trained to be able to measure effectiveness and monitor effectiveness of programs, to evaluate them on an ongoing basis. That means, as Radin points out, that people who work in the public sector have had to become better trained and educated in precisely the way that the audiences being affected by the policies are savvy on an issue. To manage health care, you have to know the intricacies of health care. To manage housing or transportation programs, you have to be expert on the substance of those issues. That means that government has had to pay more to hire and train and equip people who are adroit at doing these things. That's another resource issue. And it's a relatively recent horizon resource issue in a lot of countries around the world. It's a big public policy challenge. Final observation on that, this phenomenon has tended to blur the distinction. This is one of the things I think that Radin points out implicitly. It's blurred the distinction between the public officials and the policy analysts. That in fact, over time, many middle-level bureaucrats within federal and state agencies have in effect become analysts. They not only carry out a policy, but they're compelled to evaluate it. We see this in California in the state treasurer's office, for example. They not only report on how much income the state is earning and how much is going out, but now the state treasurer's office is sort of expected to assess various public policies and whether or not the money is being spent in a wise way. You notice that? In effect, it's the imposition of a policy analytic set of skills on the very people who are not necessarily supposed to be doing that. But it's a combination of resource scarcity and yet the need to have that expertise. Next week, we're going to talk about evaluation. But I do want to give you a heads up because it's related to this issue of implementation in the following way. Another resource issue. There are no policies, and certainly no recent policies anywhere in the world, that do not require almost intrinsically in their strategies for the gathering of information to monitor effectiveness and to carry out the policy. Almost all public policies today have within them the requirement that the beneficiaries of the policy or the people that implement the policy have to evaluate the policy. You know where you see this really clearly in California is with our public university system, both the Cal State system and the UC systems. The Office of the President for the UC system in Oakland, one of the functions they perform is they have to report to the state on an annual basis what the university is doing with state revenues, and moreover, how it is contributing to very specific sets of parameters that the regents have outlined. Not just how many students are being graduated, but how many patents are being registered to the University of California, because that's a source of revenue to both the university and to the state. The economic spin-offs from university activities, inventions, economic productivity, improvements in the quality of life. And in fact, the university puts out a yearbook every year. And it's very nice. A lot of pretty pictures in there. But it's not just for that consumption. It's a way of reporting your effectiveness as an institution. Some people would say it's a good example of the feedback loop in public policy. What you're doing is you're reporting back on the demand side what you've achieved with the resources you have and why the system should continue to support you. So in recent years, as you could imagine, as resources have become scarcer, greater thought has been given to how to present those outcomes. It's in effect a self-analysis, a self-assessment of what the university does. And every great public university does this. It has to be done in order to do this. There are some issues here, and we'll come back to these issues in more detail next week, but I do want to highlight them now because they underscore the resource demands, which is what we're talking about. Is long-term trend data available? If it's not, then you're going to have to go out and get that data. You're going to have to mine it. You're going to have to hire people to find it. If you're dealing with public health problems, you're going to have to come up with a way of reconstructing epidemiologically things that have happened in the past so that you can actually make a bona fide case that we've made progress in spending money. Are presumed relationships compatible, and can causality be well established? I know these are questions that you get asked all the time in methods classes, but here's the payoff in public policy. Governments and government agencies get asked the same question. If you're claiming that the spending of money or the creation of a set of rules or the establishment of a set of partnerships are changing X, improving health, increasing nutrition, making sure that more families are being fed. Remember our discussion of food stamps on Tuesday. People are going to ask you to establish causality. Can you, in fact, relate two variables in some way? And if you can't, if there's some intervening set of variables, can you establish what those are? And this costs money. And are the data and conclusions trustworthy and high in confidence? Questions? Questions about this?
I have a question because it seems like one of the problems with like the negative view of the stimulus bill is because causality hasn't been firmly established.
That's great, yeah, that's a great example.
How would you establish causality in a situation like that? Because you can't really have like a control group.
Oh, that's right. And part of the problem is there's a fundamental disagreement over methodology. One of the debates that's come up with the stimulus bill of 2009 that I think exemplifies this very well is the fact that no government agency, not the Labor Department, not the Commerce Department, not the Treasury Department, not the Council on Economic Advisors, none of them, by their own admission, have been able to establish categorically how many jobs have been created as a result of the stimulus bill. There have been guesses. A number of advocacy organizations have, of course, made their own guesses based on what they are advocating for you to believe. And they've used all kinds of models to try to ascertain it. There's no consensus on a viable model. What is interesting, however, is that the official view of the federal agencies that are in charge of monitoring these numbers is they've tried to come up with a consensus in the other direction. And they apparently have some methodologies that seem to not only have consensus within the government, but are externally being validated by economists and academic institutions and elsewhere who don't really have a dog in the fight. And the statistic I'm talking about is not how many jobs were created, but how many jobs were probably not additionally lost. Been following this argument? Yeah, it's kind of a reverse logic on the unemployment rate. Well, given the number of jobs that were being lost on a month-by-month basis, as recorded by the Labor Department, and given the sectors in which those jobs were being lost in, since the stimulus bill and its expenditures on public works, on infrastructure, on, what am I leaving now? Public service work, police, teachers, and so forth. You can see a direct relationship between the decline in job loss, or the stabilization of employment, and stimulus expenditures. That seems to be a statistic that does resonate within the government and external communities as well. Now, how fine a point do you want to put on these things? If you're trying, from a political standpoint, if you go before voters and you say, well, we spent X billions of dollars and the rate of unemployment is declining compared to what it would have been if we didn't do this. That's not an easy sell. That's not the kind of thing that's going to get you a 5-minute soundbite on the evening news and make you look like a hero. Well, fewer jobs have been lost than would have been lost, but it's true, or it seems to be true. And that is an important thing. So one can say from a policy analytic framework, if the goal was to somehow change, to somehow create a delta, a change in what would have been a trajectory of events without the policy intervention, then you can say there definitely has been a change. Whether it's the change that many people would agree, lay people would agree, is the change you'd like to see, which is an upward trend of jobs. No. Does that help? Yeah. So there is this methodology debate. It's a very, very important issue. Talia?
Well, I understand about the methodology debate and makes it a lot a bit different, but my question is, are the public policies designed so that the evaluation is built in based on self-evaluation and self-reported data?
That's a good question, and it depends on the policy area and what Congress decides. Increasingly, the trend has been that the agencies do their own initial evaluation, and they, in effect, kind of choose their own methodology. However, increasingly with an understanding that the same data that they used must be made available to independent auditors. And the principal independent auditor is the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. And it's very interesting if you've ever read GAO reports. They don't go out and gather new data. What they do is they go into an agency and they just take the numbers that you generate. The Defense Department says, well, we spent so many billion on this new weapons system, and by gosh, it's a good weapons system. So the GAO comes in, they take your data, then they go out to the factory where the new airplane was built, and they go out and they talk to the people that fly it, and they go out and they say, well, we're getting kind of a different set of outcomes here. You're taking these numbers and you're not using them in the right ways, or you're making assumptions about certain things that don't seem to be holding up about reliability or safety or security. But they don't do independent research. They basically take the same data but independently evaluate. So that's kind of the way it works. The first step is internal evaluation. The next step is an external audit. And if needed, a third step might be having a special commission to investigate or validate what's going on.
Well, I think
Yeah.
it's not feasible to get to generate another set of data, have other people come in and do evaluations, so we do the best we can.
Yeah.
But different data, differently collected data would present wholly different results.
That's right. That's right. And so that's one of the reasons you have to be very careful in making a comparison that's viable and valid. So let's talk about trust funds. Wanted to focus in on this. This is about as recent as it gets. The federal fiscal year 2012 budget. When will that take shape? Well, it was supposed to take shape last fall. Okay, but of course, we miss that. We always miss budgets in the federal government. That's kind of perennial. But the Obama administration is proposing something very significant. Some of you might be aware of this. I think it really dovetails with our discussion about the sources and implementation. They're proposing to alter the funding mechanisms for not just highways, but other forms of transit. And you can read it for yourself, but it's very significant. The administration, through the Department of Transportation, through Secretary Ray LaHood, who is the Secretary of Transportation, wants to replace the fund by renaming it the Transportation Trust Fund. What do you think? Why should all of that money go to cars? Go to highways? What about high-speed rail? What about low-speed rail? What about any kind of rail? Yeah.
Well, it doesn't anyway, does it? I mean, isn't like a share already dedicated to transit?
Yes. And that's the problem. It's too small, in the Obama administration's opinion, because it's too prescribed to be a small percentage. So it's a very good point. The point here, you would have separate accounts for highways, transit, high-speed rail, what's called a national infrastructure bank. I love that phrase. It's a very interesting phrase, a national infrastructure bank. In the near term, highways would see only a slightly smaller share of the trust fund that also go to intercity transit and rail. But longer term, it would move away from a dedicated highway trust fund, signaling the administration's desire to wean the country away from the automobile. That is a quote from Secretary Ray LaHood. But essentially, we now are at a critical point in the nation's history where we have to think very seriously about real alternatives to the private automobile. These disparate pots would, over time, be streamlined by putting them into a larger pool that would make the Department of Transportation more nimble in funding good projects. Now, there's more detail here. Didn't permit on the slide, but good detail. Some of these things have already been appearing in other parts of transportation policy over time. What would be a good project? How about an integrated transportation plan? Instead of coming to the federal government with a plan to build a new highway or to build a new spur, instead cities and states that want money from the trust fund have to come up with an integrated plan that shows how they're going to interlink roads with rail, with intercity transit, maybe even with greenways and bikeways. Now, in fact, a number of federal transportation laws, ICE-T, early part of the decade, in fact, is aiming at that direction. But the change here, which is a very subtle but important change, is by changing the nature of the trust fund and allowing monies to be shifted around that you may pay out of gasoline taxes into the fund to allow the government to more nimbly shift from account to account depending on the needs as they're defined within these integrated plans, is a major change in resource implementation. What do you think the odds of this change being made are? It's a terrible question to be asking on Thursday morning. Do you think the chances would be good? I think there will be opposition to this. I think the road building industry would maybe not be so thrilled about this.
Well, it's still pretty hypothetically, and they kind of, I mean, saying, okay, we want to shift it on long term means, but they kind of don't fix it in any law or anything, or any regulation, means that you could easily just don't do it. It's another administration.
No, that's exactly right. This is part of the budget, but it has to be approved by Congress, which means Congress, of course, authorizes the budget. So the change in the trust fund has to be authorized by Congress. The Obama administration is using the argument, we're not asking for more revenue. It's already established as a trust fund. Revenue is already coming in through a guaranteed source. We're not asking for more revenue. We're not even going to ask for an increase in the existing taxes. We're just asking to be able to manage the trust differently to reflect national needs, right?
You see states and regions arguing that it's going to mean the money is going to be allocated more disproportionately because transit and high-speed rail benefit very specific areas and are less distributed in the country.
Right. That's exactly right. And it's going to be kind of an electoral college effect, in essence, by which I mean larger, more populated states, particularly that are also, by definition, practically more urbanized, would be more favored under this trust fund wrinkle. One of the things that the Federal Highway Trust Fund, and one of the reasons it's been so popular as it's configured, is Utah, in effect, gets as much benefit as California. They have fewer people, but they have interstate highways. You got to go through Utah to get, to California. Go that latitude of the country. If you change it to this, you are in effect redefining what constitutes needs, which means it's going to favor. And it's a very good way of thinking about it. Again, we keep coming back to these issues of the sub-government and how these calculations play out among interests. What interests will be winners? What interests might see themselves as being losers? Sally?
I feel like even though every state has highways, I mean, I've been in South Dakota, North Dakota, they certainly have highways. There's still, different amounts of highways. I mean, there's less highways in South Dakota and Utah than there are in California.
Sure.
So there's already sort of an apportioning of highways based on population. And the same thing would happen with any kind of high-speed rail and public transportation
Right.
that would be implemented.
Right. So what grounds would they really have to complain? Their needs are satisfied, is what you're essentially suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, if Utah is okay with having, less highways based on a smaller population, then surely they'd be also okay with less.
Well, in North Dakota, I pay so much in federal gasoline taxes. I don't think that money should go to California to build a high-speed rail system that I'm not going to use. I think that money should come back to North Dakota. I mean, that's kind of how that argument plays out. But your point is very well taken. And you see the equity debate here. And this is exactly how Congress is going to argue. Florida, California, other northeastern corridor states will probably say this is a good thing to do. But in the Senate, where every state has the same number of votes, it's not going to quite probably play out that way. So another hand. Yeah.
I'm just afraid, yes, California, for example, is a place that definitely needs something like this. But I feel like people aren't going to use it because we're so accustomed to having our car.
Yes.
And it's so convenient. I went to school in Santa Barbara, I live in San Diego. Taking the train took 6-7 hours, whereas I could drive
Yes.
in 3 with less money than what the Amtrak ticket would cost. So I think there's just no cost benefit for people. That's why they just use their car as much as gas is expensive now. To take the train to Santa Barbara and back was $70. I can fill up my tank for less than that and have my car with me the whole trip.
That's a very good point, and it raises a deeper question, which I want to resonate back to all of you. So, this being the case, how do proponents of these trust funds argue this anyway? I mean, why should, well, let me rephrase that. Once upon a time, we didn't have freeways. We didn't have interstate highways. The federal government gave money to states to build a U.S. highway system, but those roads were really built mostly by the states. The federal government selected the routes, but the states built the roads, the states maintained the roads, the federal government would give a little money for upkeep, about 10% of the cost. The interstate highway system flips it around. 90% of the cost is absorbed by the federal trust fund. 10% comes from the states, okay? States usually pay for the signage, okay? Federal government really pays for the concrete, okay? Building these things. There is an argument that has been made beginning in the 1950s that said effectively, had it not been for federal intervention into a highway system, maybe the automobile would not have become the favored way of inner city travel. That in effect, what the federal government did, perhaps inadvertently, was by creating an efficient, at least in the 50s it was efficient, an efficient system of interstate highways. Go across the country, we never stopped. I remember my dad saying, "This is great, you can drive from New York to California without a stop sign, stop line. What a great thing." Yeah, right. Well, Dad, let me tell you. Oh, anyway, yeah, a little bit in there. But yeah, so what you've done is that you've made automobile travel cheaper. You've made it more economical. You've increased the demand. You've made it more viable. Prior to that, people used to take trains. Right? They didn't take planes, they took trains. We actually had trains in the United States. In effect, what I'm getting at is that subsidies of various sorts favor certain economic sectors, which over time may bias against other sectors. And this is how this argument, I think, resonates. What proponents of this change are saying is we've been favoring the automobile for a long time. We have, in fact, subsidized the automobile industry by building a cheap transport system. Even with your road taxes, let's face it, it's not very much money. When was the last time you complained? My gosh, I have to pay that darn gasoline tax today, and it just really irritates me. I can't pay my rent. No, I mean, it just disappears. You don't think about it, right? But you're getting this benefit. That being the case, the argument is used, maybe it's time we subsidize another form of transportation for a while until it can get on its feet. You've probably heard this argument made about rail, but I just kind of throw that out there because I think there's an important argument that can be made that all of these policies end up favoring or subsidizing or promoting certain sectors. And the high-speed rail industry will say, sure, we need a subsidy. We're going to need something to jumpstart this. But once it's jump-started, we can be self-sufficient, just like the automobile industry. Other questions, comments? It's a good point. It's a very good point. This is the kind of logistical argument that is going to be taking place for some time to come.
Well, furthermore, you have to separate your own personal costs with the macroeconomic costs, which are way higher if you take your car, since you have all the external factors. There's traffic jams and accidents, healthcare that, like after accidents, you're injured, and all this. And in fact, if you had to pay all these yourself and without being subsidized by the whoever pays it, you might reconsider taking a car.
Yeah, you raise a very important point, which I think resonates with particularly Stone's argument about symbols in public policy. Externalities. We pay gasoline taxes, and so we think we're purchasing the privilege of being able to use our automobile on these federally trust fund paid for roads. But are we in fact paying for the pollution and its mitigation? Are we paying for the health effects that may be caused by the automobile as we pass through cities and schools located and built? Professor Houston's been doing a tremendous amount of research on this. Makes a pretty compelling argument about environmental justice. An interstate highway that passes through an elementary school, bad, not a good thing. Okay, so are those externalities captured? And the answer is usually no. We're paying for one specific slice of the policy pie. We're not really paying for all of them. So if you're really going to make comparisons in terms of nimble, the DOT might say, well, an integrated transportation policy would be one that embraces efficiency, but also embraces equity, and further embraces environmental externalities. And if you can nimbly move funds back and forth between different transportation modes, you might achieve a more rational set of policy outcomes than you do if you simply funnel money in and funnel it out to one thing. Does that make sense? That's kind of the argument that's being made by a lot of these proponents. Symbolically, however, the automobile is freedom. And I don't want any restriction on my freedom. Right? Well, we've all heard that one. Let's end up, this morning I want to talk about feedback and policy readjustment. The phrase principal-agent theory was used in another context a few weeks ago when we talked about information. And it also applies very, very strongly and directly. And I hope maybe we'll get to this case study this morning. If not, we'll pick it up on Tuesday. But basically, principal-agent theory applies in that top level and what we called on Tuesday street level. Remember the distinction? Top-level bureaucrats, street-level bureaucrats or officials, and the public define public policy problems differently. In fact, everything we've been talking about this morning, I think, exemplifies that. Depending on where you stand in the policy process, you might define a problem from a different perspective. It's partly a function of the different kinds of knowledge that people hold within society. There is such a thing as local knowledge versus expert knowledge. We see this problem in urban planning, for example, with anti-poverty programs and community development programs. One of the criticisms of policies that are implemented from above and dictate from the top down what should be done is that they don't really take into account the needs of people who may be more aware of problems from the vantage point of a local neighborhood. Maybe they understand nutrition issues or environmental justice issues more acutely than somebody sitting at the top of the bureaucracy. Now here's where principal-agent theory is a very important tool for understanding this. According to PAT, principal-agent theory, feedback is affected, get this, very interesting social science concept, by what subordinates think their bosses want to hear. How many of us have ever worked in bureaucracies? Yes, thank you. Okay. What do they want me to tell them? Is this policy effective? Let me think about that for a while. And the degree to which principals rely on subordinates for information about what's really occurring on the ground. Do principals really want to know? Do they ask? Do they inquire? Or would they rather not know because, how did Mr. Gore put it? An inconvenient truth. You know, we've all known about inconvenient truths. Many examples of this. I mentioned a couple of these last time, and I want to focus in more detail about one of these. Law enforcement, the 3 strikes policy in California, the cop on the beat, prosecuting attorneys, penal officials have a more negative view of the implications of 3 strikes than does the state legislature and previous governors of California who have supported this. Because from their vantage point, it's a publicly popular issue. People want to say, yeah, 3 strikes, you're out. Sounds great. It's a compelling rhetoric. It has a lot of symbolic value, as Stone points out. But it may not be effective if you're the person that has to charge someone with a crime or prosecute them through the system or pay for them to be incarcerated. In education, No Child Left Behind, which is a case we are going to look at specifically as how this plays out in this principal-agent theory context. Classroom teachers and principals, administrators, have a somewhat different view of No Child Left Behind than do the architects of the law. And in fact, it's not always clear. It's not that there's consensus. In fact, as we're going to see, there's a lot of dissensus, both between subordinates and principals. Some subordinates think it's very good. Some subordinates think it's not so good. Some principals think it's very good. Some principals don't think it's very good. It's a very complex interplay of principal-agent theory, as we'll see. And in disaster preparedness, emergency Responders and healthcare workers often view disasters and the needs of disaster response very differently than principals. Remember Katrina. One of the most visible and telling problems of Hurricane Katrina was from the perspective of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. You might recall, we're there, we're on the ground. We're aware of the problems. We're right there, we're responding, we're attentive. Well, they should have asked people in New Orleans. They didn't. The emergency responders and the healthcare workers on the ground were saying there was a complete disconnect, a complete and total breakdown. The principals did not want to know, and they didn't keep lines of communication open about how bad things were, what resources were needed, how quickly, how urgently. In this case, the subordinates spoke up, but they were often ignored. And the principals often didn't ask because they did not want to think about the unthinkable. Certainly, every time a major disaster strikes, we know what to do. We're assuming that people know what to do here. So, let me leave you with this thought. And on next Tuesday, we'll pick up with this case study, which is also a good case study of evaluation in some ways. We suggest that what principal-agent theory teaches is that effective feedback, and you do need effective feedback if a policy is going to be implemented well. Effective feedback occurs when the street-level bureaucrats and the upper-level officials can freely communicate. Now, that's easy to say, but what do we mean by free communication? Well, let me suggest a little deeper analysis here. Free communication means that the street-level bureaucrats, very significant, can share information with the principals honestly and without fear of penalty or retribution. What do you mean it's not working? How dare you accuse us of not? This is a real problem in public bureaucracy. It's easy to ask, why do organizations that implement policies fail? But when we think of it in these terms, it becomes a little easier to understand. Oftentimes, people at lower levels are afraid to give information because they do not believe it will be embraced, and that they will be seen as some way as either being insubordinate, ineffective, negligent, or trying to reflect badly on their supervisors. Questions or comments about this? How many of you have seen these sorts of experiences? It's very common, and it's a classic, maybe the most classic implementation problem related to feedback. All right, I'll see you next Tuesday.